Hey guys, and welcome back to another Lost Bits video right here on TetraBitGaming, the series where we explore the unused, altered, and unseen content in gaming. For years now, I've been getting requests to make a video on Kirby's Return to Dream Land, and now I have the perfect excuse to do so with the release of the remake on the Switch. Now, this isn't the first time that this game has been featured on the channel, as if in the very off chance that you've been around since the very beginning, this game actually holds a special place on this channel, as it was one of the first Let's Plays that were made way back when this was a Let's Play channel with me and my friends. Anyways, this game has quite a bit for us to go through, so suck up that like button. It's time to check out some Kirby's Return to Dream Land Lost Bits. So, to kick things off for this video, we of course have to start off with this game's development history. And if you're unfamiliar with it, development history this game sure did have. And essentially, several whole games became Lost Bits in the journey to the release of this final product. Basically, it took a whopping 11 years of development to make this game, and honestly, it seems like it's almost a miracle that it even happened at all. I'm sure there are several videos on YouTube that cover the development of this game in more detail, but here we'll just go over a quicker rundown to give some more context. Anyways, development for a new Kirby game started in the year 2000, soon after the release of Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards. Development for this game had started on the GameCube, and the plan was to keep the 2.5D style that was featured in Crystal Shards, but to also incorporate a co-op multiplayer aspect, something that was severely lacking in the N64 game. Eventually, after over 4 years of development, a short 52-second world premiere trailer of the game made its debut at E3 of 2005 with the temporary working title of just Kirby's Adventure. This trailer featured Kirby plowing through enemies using a bunch of his signature different copy abilities, as well as a brand new ability where Kirby could seemingly discard an ability in order to spawn a buddy character that would presumably be controllable by another player. We then see footage of a boss fight against a large robot known as HRD3, as well as more gameplay seemingly showing off the 4-player co-op aspect of this game, including a small snippet of the classic fight against Wispy Woods. And although the game seemed like it was pretty far along in development at this point, this, along with some screenshots, was the last we'd ever see of this game, at least in this state. 1 year went by, and then another, and still no more signs of this Kirby game were seen, and this started making Kirby fans concerned as the game was seemingly appearing and disappearing from lists of upcoming Nintendo games. But when asked about the state of the Kirby GameCube game, then Senior Director of Corporate Communications, Beth Llewellyn, had said to not forget about Kirby, and had basically revealed that the project had not been abandoned and even moved over to the Nintendo Wii. However, despite this reassurance, several years went by with no new main series console Kirby game news coming from Nintendo. And after seeing Kirby's epic yarn announced for the Wii, fans were starting to think that that was what the GameCube game had turned into, and that the 2.5D style Kirby sequel had been canned. But a few years later, a financial briefing from Nintendo revealed that in fact, another new Kirby game was in development for the Wii. And only a few months later, new footage for the upcoming sequel was shown off, and finally, at E3 of 2011, the game was officially revealed as Kirby Wii. Both of these trailers showed off a pre-release build of Kirby's Return to Dream Land, where, although overall it looks pretty complete, a few small changes can be noted. Stuff like the heads-up display graphics being different, some textures were more basic, and the worst difference was that Kirby's cake here didn't have any frosting in the E3 trailer. This is so sad. Anyways, there are quite a few more smaller changes seen in these builds when compared to the final release, but in the interest of time I won't be going over them here, but as always, if you're interested in reading up on all of them, there's a very handy list of all the documented changes over on the cutting room floor, which also, as always, will be linked for you down in the description. Now you may be wondering, what exactly happened in those years between the GameCube trailer and the final release for it to be delayed for so long? Well, thankfully, we have at least some context given to us for what was going on behind the scenes. For one, according to one of the Iwata Asks interviews, the GameCube game that was shown off wasn't the only Kirby game that was sent back to the drawing board, as there were actually a total of 3 Kirby games that were cancelled. One of these was another more traditional 2D side-scrolling Kirby game, while the other one was a new fully 3D experience, something that, at the time, had never been done in a Kirby game before. The side-scrolling game was supposed to have been made in the style of a pop-up book, and the 3D Kirby game would have featured an interesting isometric view, kind of like Super Mario 3D World. It's unclear if or how much of this game was repurposed into Kirby and the Forgotten Land on the Switch, but of course there are some similarities. And unfortunately, outside of just these two screenshots, this is all that's really known about these two cancelled games. Now, several factors were given for the decision to scrap the concepts for these two games, as well as the GameCube game that was shown off at E3 of 2005. Either the movement didn't feel right, the developers wanted to deliver more of a surprise to the fans, as well as apparent difficulties in developing a Kirby game that could be played both single player as well as multiplayer. But overall, as the saying goes, it seems like these three cancelled games walked so Kirby's Return to Dream Land could run, so to speak. Now furthermore, there is actually a whole ton of concept art for the game that reveals a bunch of really cool scrapped ideas that were never shown off in any of the cancelled games, and of course never made it into Return to Dream Land either. There's everything from concepts of some landscapes, a bunch of enemies, some sort of train-themed boss or stage, a scrapped concept for the main menu of the game, an old version of HRD3 where it was designed much more similar to and also controlled by King Dedede, and this is also different to how it was seen in the original GameCube trailer. There's concept art of this fella that's believed to have been meant to be the game's original final boss. And finally, my favorite is this concept art of Morpho Knight, who, yeah, was actually once intended to make a debut in the scrapped Kirby GameCube game way before Kirby Star Allies. Anyways, yeah, that's a brief look into the history of the games that were scrapped in the long journey paving the way for what eventually became Kirby's Return to Dream Land. Alright, now let's switch gears and talk about the unused content that's left over in the final retail release of the game. And to start things off, let's have a look at some unused graphics. Firstly, there are leftover textures for several enemies that reveal a hurt expression for each that was scrapped. For the Waddle-Doo enemies, there's this texture that would have made it look like its eye was tearing up. There's this texture for the hotheads that would make them look like they're grimacing in pain. And then there are also eye-closing textures for both the Cappies as well as Krabbies. It's unclear why exactly these didn't end up getting used, but interestingly, although slightly altered, many of these did go on to be implemented in the next Kirby game built using this engine, Kirby Triple Deluxe. Then similarly, although not necessarily for a damaged state, there are unused angry expression textures for the Togekukis as well as the Ticks. Then next is this texture of Kirby's bomb hat that reveals an alternate design to the party hat style seen in this game. It bears obvious resemblance to the old blue hat style seen in prior games, so it looks like initially that style was going to also be seen here before the decision was made to change to the new one. Next, we have an alternate design for this fella named Wolf. Although generally the same, you'll immediately notice that the unused version lacks the blue top of its head, and additionally, the eye texture is different and looks more refined in the final iteration. And also, there's this texture that's for an unused state for the Wolves for closing their eyes, once again thought to be for a damaged state. And similarly to the Wolves, there's also this early texture for the Needlos enemies. It's not quite as different as the Wolf one, but the textures just seem more simple compared to the final version. And similar to that, there are also two unused textures for the coconuts that the Bonker enemies throw at you. One in a simpler, more cartoon-like style, as well as pretty much on the opposite side, there's one in a more realistic style too. And then lastly for the enemy textures, there are a bunch of eye and body textures for the Gulbo and Water Gulbo enemies. And then, although the texture itself isn't unused, there's actually an eye that's hidden in the textures for the Flamer enemies that's never normally seen otherwise. Then, beyond just being an unused texture, there's actually a whole unused enemy that's left over in the files of the game. This fella is listed as a Herebell, and it appears to be some sort of flower enemy, and it would apparently either gobble up Kirby or latch onto him similarly to how the Pacto enemies do. Thankfully, to give us more context, there are also several animations left over for the Herebell enemy as well, and these, of course, also go unused. Now next up, there are also some unused graphics related to a pair of the game's bosses. First, there are several unused textures for Goliath with some darker skin as well as rocking a red coat of fur instead of white as is seen in the used version. Additionally, there are a bunch of textures for Goliath's eyes blinking in a regular as well as powered up enraged state. And then the other set of unused boss graphics are for none other than Kirby series staple Wispy Woods, where in addition to an unused body texture, there are also 2 unused sets of bushes where they look quite cartoony. Now this is 1000% speculation, but these kind of look similar in style to the scrapped pop-up book style Kirby game that we went over earlier, so maybe these are some sort of remnant from that game. Next up, we got this unused placeholder graphic listed in the folder for ability icons simply as water, with the Japanese text here translating to temporary. So if you're Galaxy Brain and can put 2 and 2 together here, this appears to be a placeholder tile for the water ability. And then, strangely, there's also this unused graphic of Kirby inhaling a Waddle Dee and spitting it back out as a star. And what makes this interesting is that this is actually artwork from Kirby Nightmare in Dreamland for the Game Boy Advance. Now this graphic is found amongst those used for the tutorial windows that pop up in the first few stages of the game, so this was probably a placeholder image that was used to test those before the proper ones were made up. Then moving on, next up we have some unused textures of what looks to be King Dedede as well as a pair of eyes, and these are actually found amongst those for HRD3. This would make sense, as we discussed earlier that HRD3 was originally designed after King Dedede and would have even been controlled by him, so I guess these being left in here are a remnant from those plans for the original GameCube version that was shelved. And also found amongst the files for HRD3 is this unused texture for the Warp Star. When placed over the Warp Star model, we can see that this appears to be an early texture for the star of sorts. Now next up are several unused graphics relating to Kirby's copy abilities. First, and frankly not as interesting, are several early versions of a bunch of the ability icons used for the challenge rooms. And these, at first inspection, may look about the same, and it isn't until you look really closely where you can start seeing that the early and unused variants are found in a lower quality. The biggest difference, however, is seen in the ability icon that's used for the item challenge rooms, where Kirby's smile was changed, his pupils removed, the shapes were changed, and oh yeah, the background used to be red instead of white. Now, although seen for the ninja ability icon, there's also this unused texture that was meant for one of the challenge door icons too. No ninja challenge stage is ever seen in the game, so this suggests that there may have once been one planned that was cut. Next up, there are actually 2 unused textures of a stopwatch that would have been for an also unused copy ability, or rather, lack thereof. Yeah, these are textures for Kirby's default state as well as a default super ability that are left in the game. Since you can just get rid of a copy ability at any point, there's really no other point in these, and yeah, that's probably why these were scrapped. On the other hand though, there are also 2 super abilities that were cut from the game that are more interesting, the first of these being the Super Spark. Now apparently the data for this ability was overwritten by the Ultra Sword, so all we have left of this ability is this star icon, so all we can really do is speculate as to how it would function. Thankfully enough though, on the flip side, the other super ability that was cut has a bit more left over for us, and this is for the Super Cutter. In addition to the star icon graphic, there's also a leftover graphic for the hat to be used on Kirby's head in the heads-up display, and there's even an unused model for the hat left in the game too. And then to top it all off, there are even leftover animations for Kirby that were going to be used as part of this move, where we can see him throwing and catching the cutter both on the ground as well as in the air. Now it's not 100% clear why either of these super abilities were scrapped, but at least for the Super Cutter, it's theorized that it might have gotten the snips since it might have been deemed a bit too similar to Kirby's Ultra Sword ability. And now, speaking of unused animations, we've already mentioned a few, but there are actually a whole truckload more of these kicking around in the files of this game. First up, we have unused animations for a bunch of enemies. Now I mentioned the tick enemies earlier with their scrapped angry expression, but there are also unused animations for them where they would be seen just bobbing up and down. Then there are unused animations for the Broom Hatter slipping and falling down, sliding as well as standing back up, Chili transitioning into and performing a jump as well as an idle pose, which although isn't used in the final game, was actually briefly seen in the original E3 trailer for the shelved GameCube game. There's an unused idle animation for the Needlos enemies, several for the Scarfy, including for them jumping, which they never do since they, well, fly. There's animations for both Naughty and Sir Kibble walking, neither of which ever happen in the game. Attacking animations for Como as well as Togekuki, several unused animations for both the regular Waddle Dees as well as the Halcandron variants. There's a bunch of unused animations for the Poppy Bros where they can be seen walking both on and off of a bomb as well as falling and landing with one. And there are even some unused animations for a few of the game's mini-bosses too. We got unused flinching animations for the Gigant Edge, similar flinching animations for Kibble Blade, as well as one where it's seen struggling. And then there are also several unused spinning and teleporting animations for the Dubois mini-boss, including this one really weird test one where it's like slowly squishing down and then coming back to normal size. And lastly for the enemies, there are scrapped animations for the Kabu enemies teleporting. This was basically their signature move for every Kirby game they appeared in up until this one, and for whatever reason, they haven't done it ever since. Now next up, we already went over a few unused animations for Kirby, but there are actually a whole bunch more left over in the game, as well as some for a few of the other playable characters. For the Pink Puff himself, we got him teetering with the Parasol ability, large cheek teetering with something in his mouth, sliding on his face as well as sliding on his back, getting up from sliding in both respective positions, hanging onto rope as well as struggling to do so. And then there are a few unused or early animations of Kirby relating to the beam ability, including some sort of unused attack where Kirby would seemingly charge up a beam attack. Next, there are some for the ninja ability for Kirby missing a grab, some for Bomb Kirby throwing a bomb on the ground, throwing a bomb mid-air, both forwards and downwards, as well as charging up a bomb mid-air. There's a test animation for the tornado ability, as well as Kirby getting dizzy and still spinning. There's a strange unused animation of Kirby yawning after getting the sleep ability. There's some sort of ability get animation where Kirby flips in the air before supposedly transforming into another ability form. And then there are also a few unused animations for Spear Kirby where Kirby is all squished and angry. And lastly for Kirby, there's an unused animation where he cycles through a bunch of facial expressions, and actually a similar one also exists for Bandana Waddle Dee, though it has less facial expressions so it doesn't cycle as long. Then moving on to King Triple D, there's this unused test animation which looks similar to the one that's used when he rides Landia, so it's believed that this was an early version of that. And then secondly, there's also this unused animation for the king attacking underwater in a large circle swing. In the final version, this never gets used as he just does a more simple vertical swing instead. Then lastly for the playable characters, there are a few unused animations for Meta Knight, including several animations borrowed from Galacta Knight, as well as this one where Meta Knight just plops down, stares at his sword, and ponders the galaxy for a little while. Now I hope you're not tired of the unused animations yet, because we have a few more to go for a few unused models left over in the game. The first of these is for an unused icy object listed as Ice Blizzard, which is also left with this shimmering animation, and these are apparently meant for the Sphere Doomers, and more specifically, presumably in the Ice Blizzard form. Then for this unused model of a golden door cover, there's also this unused animation of it shimmering too, and then there's this unused undulating animation for this thing listed as Bubble, and this is apparently some sort of weapon that was meant for the main antagonist in the game. And finally, the last unused model is actually a duplicate of Kirby that's found amongst the files for the Mike ability. Although almost identical to Kirby, by using the same textures, they don't appear to display properly, and he ends up looking like this instead. Ooh, that's gotta be a record for the most unused animations I think I've ever covered in a single video. Anyways, with those out of the way now let's talk about some of the bits of audio that go unused in Kirby's Return to Dreamland. Now first up, there are two sound effects that go unused, both of which are for Magolor. both of these sound a bit less intense than how they're heard in the final game. Then next, there are several unused songs left over in the game too. A bunch of these are just earlier and lower quality versions of tracks that are heard in the game or are just lacking a small intro segment, so for this video we'll just skip over some of those and focus more on what I believe are more interesting tracks that go unused in the game. For starters, there's a track from the Japanese Super Nintendo release Kirby no Kira Kira Kizu, or Kirby Star Stacker as it was released on the Game Boy outside of Japan. Next up is a cut shorter fanfare track that, based on the GCK in the name, is thought to have maybe been a leftover from the original GameCube plans for this game. Interestingly enough, apparently this track was later repurposed and used in Kirby Star Allies, as well as in all of the Kirby games on the 3DS. Then next up are two more fanfares that are theorized to have been meant for entering one of the game's hidden dimensional portals. There's one that sounds more cheery, as well as one more ominous sounding one. Next, we got another upbeat track listed as HEITI1, and this appears to be a remix of the song Green Greens and Over the Hills. Now, this word is apparently a transliterated Japanese word that when translated to English means plains. So based on that, this appears to have been possibly meant as a track for the Cookie Country level. Next, there are alternate versions of two tracks that seem to use quite different instrumentation between the unused early version and the final one. These include an early, more retro-sounding track for Sky Tower, and then similarly for Cave Expedition as well. And then, lastly, for the unused audio, there are a few alternate themes for the super ability theme played when using the Ultra Sword in the Grand Doomer boss fight. There are 3 of these unused variations, each sounding slightly different, so here's a quick sample of all 3, as well as a comparison to the final one that's used. Now, moving along, there's actually a really cool purple switch left over in the files that unfortunately never ended up getting used, at least in this game. Now, this button still has leftover functionality that, as seen in this gameplay by Reserved, can toggle stuff like doors open and closed to however a player would want. Similar switches can be seen in this game in other colors like blue, which gets permanently pressed once activated, as well as red ones which are activated only temporarily. But yeah, these purple ones that could be toggled on and off at will never made the cut, and yeah, like I said, not in this game, as they would apparently eventually get repurposed in the future 3DS titles in the series. Next up, there are archived file path text references to a whole bunch of unused maps for this game, a whopping 335 in fact. There's everything here, from test rooms for various abilities, bosses, as well as just a bunch of general test maps it seems. Now, to my immense disappointment, and you know how much I love my test maps, unfortunately, aside from just these file paths teasing us, there's no other remnants of these maps left over in the game. So yeah, they unfortunately aren't accessible or anything like that. F's in the chat. It's really unfortunate, but I just wanted to bring this up here to share my pain. Hopefully someday a prototype build of this game or something surfaces where maybe some of these will still be intact. Anyways, next up, there are actually 3 unused cutscenes that are left over in the game, and these can actually still be re-enabled with some cheats. The first of these is listed as Prototype Movie OP, with OP likely standing for opening, as this seems to be an early version of the game's opening, as it appears very similar to the opening in the game with only a few visual effects missing. Then, on the flip side, there's Prototype Movie ED, and this likely stands for ending, and this time we can see the Lore Starcutter ship floating in space and getting rebuilt with its various parts. The cutscene then transitions to several panning shots of the rebuilt ship docked on the ground before a "to be continued" fades onto the screen. And then lastly, there's an unnamed unused cutscene left over that starts with a 3-2-1 countdown before a very similar cutscene to the first part of the previous one starts playing. It's largely the same, only this time the space background appears different, as here the stars zipping by appear much brighter. And now, last up for this video, there's actually a lone debug feature that's left over for us in the final release of this game, and this is an ability to visualize the hitboxes of Kirby, enemies, as well as certain objects in the game. Each color of hitbox here also apparently relates to a certain effect. For example, grab hitboxes are colored green, damage hitboxes are red, etc. Although I do wish there were some more debug features left over, this is still a pretty cool one to have left in, and it's an interesting way to visualize how some enemies damage Kirby. Anyways, that's about it for Kirby's Return to Dream Land. I know many of you have wanted me to cover this game on Lost Bits for a while, so I hope it was worth the wait, and shoutouts to you if you've made it all the way to the end here. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to check out some of my other Lost Bits, and make sure to subscribe to find your way back here in the future. And as always, thank you all so much for stopping by today, and I will see you in a bit.